All right, so this is a lecture about biodiversity. So think about what biodiversity means. Okay, so bio, if you break it down to its parts, means life, and diversity means variety and differences. So biodiversity just means differences in the types of life that there are. So like talking about different plants, different animals, but also things like habitats and resources that are essential for all living things to survive. So biodiversity is just kind of like all of the components of a particular area or ecosystem and how diverse it is. Oh man, okay. So here's a picture that I just stole off Google. So what biodiversity do you see in this picture? Well, you should notice that there are many different areas in here. There's this shrubby area. There's this open space. There are these cliffs back here, and even farther back, there are some foothill type of things. So we also have things like in the air, it looks really, really open. There's no big tall trees. There's many different areas on here. Even though this is a small picture, you can see a variety of different places in this landscape. So by that same token, you can look at biodiversity in terms of habitat. For example, I can have an organism that lives in this little shrub right here. I can have an organism that lives underneath the shrub. Just maybe it has a nest down there on the ground. It can be underneath the shrub, within the ground, in the dirt. There can also be animals that set up camp in this open space, in this area. There's some that are going to be at higher elevation. So there's many different places where things can live. So one way to think about biodiversity is where different organisms can set up camp and have their home, where they raise their babies, where they hunt. This picture, which doesn't look like it's anything special, really shows a lot of biodiversity when it comes to different habitats or zones. So here's another picture, biodiversity here. Well, one way that you can look at it is by looking at the different types of organisms that you see. I see lily pads, I see these ferns, I see some grass, some cattails, some trees. There's also many different types of animals, raccoon, deer, bugs. There's 3 different types of bugs. There's some fish in here, there's some turtles, there's daisies. And there's also some different zones in here if we think about habitats. There's in the water, there's at the surface, there's in the middle, there's at the bottom, there's underneath the water in the soil. There's some that live on the shore, there's going to be some that live up in the elevation, in the forest. There's some that are going to be living, in an intermediate part. So the biodiversity that you see here is actually really, really complex in the amount of habitats and in life forms. So here's another picture. Let's talk about the variety here. They're all ladybugs, right? But we still have biodiversity here. They're all ladybugs, but they all have some differences. For example, there's some red ones. There's some lighter ones. There's big ones. There's small ones. There's some with more dots. There's some with less dots. There's some that have maybe a different shape. For example, maybe being a little bit more oval versus hella round. So even though that may look like we're all pretty uniform in the type of organism that we're talking about, there's still a lot of biodiversity in here, especially when you're talking about genetic. So when we talk about biodiversity, and I'm sorry, this is kind of cut off here. So if we look at biodiversity, there are actually 3 different things that you can be looking at. Ecosystems, which is the interaction of living and non-living things. There are the species, talking about solely living things when it comes to plants and animals. And there's also genetic biodiversity. So it's important that we have diversity at each of these places, that we have different areas, hot places, cold places, forest places, desert forests. We have a variety of different species, and within those populations, we have different forms of phenotypes. Thinking back to the slide that I had before about the ladybugs. So why is biodiversity important? Well, it allows for ecosystems to function. So think about what organisms need to survive. They need food, they need water, they need shelter, they need places to go, places to roam. Some animals require quite a large area in order to live. So I watched a documentary a couple weeks ago about, I believe it was a Siberian tiger, and they take up hundreds of square miles because they're territorial. They don't like to live close to others. So when you think about the organism's needs, you're going to need a diverse landscape in order to support many different organisms that are going to be exploiting those different areas for their habitat, to find their food, to hide, to have shelter, all that jazz. So it's important for survival of all of those different organisms. So again, you need food, water, and shelter, and ecosystems offer that. And the more variety of these things and the different types, the more organisms that it can support. So here's an example. So this is of a food web. So it's a model that shows the interactions of living things. So it shows what eats what. So the cheetah eats the Thompson gazelle, which eats, this one shows it's eating the topi, but that ain't right. Eating, I don't know why it says that this thing is eating a warthog, because it's definitely not. Other example, the curassow is eating the mongoose, which is eating the dung beetle, which eats the stargrass. So it kind of shows the interactions and the variety of diets. So, geez, sorry guys. Whew. So this says up here, why is it a good thing that the ant eats two different types of plants? So when looking at the ant, you can see that it eats the stargrass and the, what does that say? Bedcat grass. Okay, so he has a variety of food sources, and the biodiversity within this landscape supports 3 different types of plants. So you got to think about it. What if the stargrass were to go extinct? If this was the only thing that it ate, if there was minimal biodiversity, then there would only be one option. And then if, heaven forbid, something were to happen to this grass, well, that would be not very good for the ant. So variety is good. It's a good thing. So here is another example. How many types of prey do lions eat? So here's a lion. Okay, so they eat wildebeest, they eat topi, they eat Thompson's gazelle, they eat impala, they eat the mouse, and what else? So they also eat the hare, and you can kind of look at all these arrows. All these arrows that are pointed to the line are the things that are going to contribute energy and nutrients to that lion. The lion eats 7 things. You know, that it has a wide variety. If something were to happen to the wildebeest, then it has the gazelle, which leads into my next question. If the wildebeest were to disappear, well, then that means that the lion is going to have to be more reliant on these other food sources in order to survive. On the other hand, the hyena, which only eats 3 of these organisms, is going to have a harder time because he's going to be relying on the aardvark and the topi. So the more diverse you have, the more available prey you have or food sources, so if anything were to happen, you can be more flexible and be able to bounce back. So here's just a note about genetic diversity. So we know from the genetics unit, that DNA leads to traits. So that genetic diversity is important because as the environment changes and there's different environmental pressures, you're going to need adaptations. So especially when we talked about the steps of natural selection, how the very first step is you've got to have genetic variation. That allows for flexibility, so that way traits can, your size can get bigger or smaller, or you can change color because you have those genes already present that can only need minuscule changes in order to have a bigger change to suit all of the things that are going on in the environment. So that genetic diversity is really important when it comes to the capacity to evolve and adapt to those changes over longer periods of time, over the course of generations. So keep that in mind. So next we're going to talk about how do scientists measure biodiversity? I should say scientists, sorry. So here's an example. Which picture shows biodiversity? More diversity. We have this one and we have this one. So when looking at this guy, I see that we have more even, but we still have all the colors represented. This one, we have far more red stars than other stars. So as far as species, both of these things are even. But as far as evenness, this one wins. And that is one measure that we can use to measure biodiversity. Scientists use species evenness and species richness to measure in an ecosystem. So evenness is the proportion, okay, how many wildebeest do I have versus the topi and the gazelles, and richness, how many, what is the raw number of different organisms do I have? Do I only have one species of birds or do I have 50? So when looking at this community, which again, if you remember, is many different species coming together at a particular location, you can look and you can compare the biodiversity in terms of evenness. So here you can see that there are far more of these grasses in this one, and it outnumbers the amount of flowers. This one is going to be more even because I have 3 trees, 3 yellow daisies, 3 grasses, and 3 tulips. This one would be more even, and they have even richness because they all have 5, right? 5, 1, 2, 3, 4 different species in each. Richness here, I have 1, 2, 3 types of organisms versus 1, 2. This one would be more rich. However, this one might be more even because I have 4 to 4. However, because I have increased richness, this one would be more diverse. So as far as biodiversity, this one would win because it is more even and, well, I guess they have both the same amount of richness. This one would be more even, so it is more biodiverse. This one, because it has more richness, this one would also be more diverse. So if you are in regular biology, you are not in LISA or pre-AP, stop here. You're done. Unless you want to learn more about the calculation of biodiversity, stop.